Folks out here will tell you the frontier has no mercy in it. They'll say it the way they say the sky is big or the water's bad, like it's just a fact you learn to live around. And for the most part, I believed them. I'd buried enough men, watched enough good ones go hard and mean over a dry season, to figure kindness was a luxury that didn't survive the second winter. Then a man named Eli Bram pulled a half-froze widow out of a wash with her wagon broke to splinters, and a boy nobody owned standing guard over her like a dog over a grave. And what he did after, that's the part they never stop telling. Some tell it like a sermon. Some tell it like a warning. I'm the only one left who saw the whole of it, start to bitter end, and I'm telling you now, it wasn't kindness that became the talk of the frontier. It was what kindness costs a man, and whether he'd pay it twice. Let me start where it started, in the rain. The first I knew of any of it was a sound I took for a calf in trouble. It was the tail end of a gray, spitting afternoon in the spring of '83, and I was riding the south fence line of the Bram place, Eli's spread, where I'd hired on 2 years prior after my knees quit on me for the trail. My name's Holly's Webb, and at that point in my life I was 51 years old, missing the back half of 3 fingers off my right hand, and possessed of a habit I'd picked up to quit the chewing tobacco. I kept a matchstick wedged in the corner of my mouth and worried it down to splinters when I had nothing useful to say, which was often. I had a little tally book in my coat too, a greasy thing tied with twine, and I wrote in it most evenings. Cattle counts mostly. Weather. Sometimes a line about how the coffee tasted or what ached. I'm not a writing man by trade, but a fellow alone gets to feeling like the things that happen to him will slip off the edge of the world if he doesn't pin them down somewhere, and that book was my pin. So the sound. I drew up Pepper, my old roan, and listened past the rain. It wasn't a calf. It was higher, more particular, the kind of cry that has a want in it, a human cry. I turned Pepper down toward the dry wash that ran the property's western edge, except it wasn't dry that day. 2 days of upcountry rain had filled it brown and quick, the way those things do out here, going from a path you'd walk across to a river that'll take your horse's legs in the time it takes to roll a smoke. And there, half in the churn of it, was the wagon. It had come off the rim of the bank. You could see the gouge where the wheels skidded and pitched nose down into the wash, and the water had got hold of the lower half and was working it like a dog works a rabbit. One ox lay drowned and tangled in its own traces. The other was gone entire, and clinging to the high side of the wagon bed, soaked to a color I can only call no color at all, was a woman, big with child. I want to be plain about that because it's the thing I saw first and the thing that froze the breath in me. She was a long way gone, 7 months or better by the swell of her, and the river wanted her. Standing on the bank above her, not 3 feet from safety, was a boy. Maybe 10, maybe younger and just hardened past his years the way frontier children get. He had a coil of rope in his hands, wagon rope, frayed, and he was not throwing it. He was just standing there with it, shaking, his mouth working, and I understood in a glance why. He'd already thrown it once. I could see the wet line of it trailing into the water. He'd thrown it and she hadn't caught it or couldn't let go to catch it. And now he was paralyzed with the arithmetic of it. Throw again and miss, and there might not be a third chance, and the missing of it would be his. I have thought about that boy on that bank more nights than I can count. A grown man freezes up over less. "Hold," I hollered, coming off Pepper before he'd fully stopped, which my knees did not thank me for. "Hold, son, I've got you." I'm not going to make myself the hero of this part. I want that understood. I got my own rope, I got it doubled, I got Pepper backed up to a cottonwood and the line dallied around the saddle horn, and then I went down that bank on my backside more than my feet, and the cold of that water when it took my legs was a thing with teeth. I'm a fair hand with a rope, but a roping calf doesn't have a baby in it and a face white as a fish belly and eyes that have already started to let go. "Reach," I told her. I had to say it 3 times. The water was loud. "Reach, ma'am, just the once. I've got the horse to pull, you just got to reach." She looked at me. I'll never forget it. There was a long second where she did the same arithmetic the boy had done, where she weighed the cost of hopping against the cost of being wrong one more time, and I watched her decide to spend the hope. She let go of the wagon with one hand and she reached, and I caught her wrist, and the river tried to argue with me about it, and Pepper, God bless that ugly roan, leaned into the cottonwood and pulled. It took everything. Both of us went under once. My bad hand lost its grip and I caught her again with the crook of my elbow and roared something that wasn't a word. The boy, somewhere above, was screaming her name, Mama, Mama, except, and this is a thing I'd learn later that mattered, it wasn't his mama. But he screamed it like it was. We came out of that wash like two drowned cats dragged by a horse, which is exactly what we were. I got her up the bank and onto the grass, and she rolled to her side and was sick. And then she got both arms around the swell of her belly and made a sound I had no name for, low and animal. And my whole gut went to ice because I thought, it's coming. The rivers brought it on. And I am a 51-year-old cowhand who knows the back end of a heifer and not one blessed thing about this. The boy threw himself down beside her, not crying, past crying, just gripping her sleeve. Is it the baby? I said like a fool. It's the cold, she got out through teeth that wouldn't stop. Just the cold and the fear, give me a minute, I've not lost it, I'd know. And that was the first full sentence I ever heard out of Sarah Coyle, and it told me most of what I needed to know about her. She lay there half drowned in a strange man's pasture with a flood at her heels and her future busted into kindling in the wash, and she was correcting me, telling me what was so and what wasn't, holding the line on her own knowing. There's a kind of person the country tries to break and can't, not because they're strong like an ox is strong, but because they keep a small hard thing in the center of themselves that they will not let go of no matter what they have to let go of around it. She was that kind. I knew it inside of a minute, and the next 2 years only proved it out. I got them up to the home place before full dark, the woman on Pepper because she couldn't walk far, the boy walking at the stirrup with his hand on her knee, and me leading and shivering and chewing a matchstick down to mush. Eli Bram met us at the barn. Now I should tell you about Eli, because the rest of this doesn't make sense without him, and because what folks came to say about Eli and what was true about Eli drifted apart over the years until you could have driven a herd between them. Eli was 40-some. A widower himself, his wife Ruth had died of a fever the winter before I came on, and they'd buried 2 infants before that, neither of which lived a week. He never spoke of any of them. There was a small fenced plot up on the rise behind the house with 3 stones in it, 2 of them no bigger than a loaf of bread, and he kept the grass off it and the weeds out, and he never once in 2 years mentioned it to me. He was a quiet man. Not cold, I want to be careful with that word because folks later called him cold and it wasn't so. He was a man who had decided somewhere along the line that the safest size for his heart was small, and he'd worked at keeping it that size the way you'd work at keeping a fire banked. Not out, just low, just survivable. He took one look at the woman on my horse, at the belly, at the boy, at the state of all 3 of us, and I watched something happen in his face that I'd never seen there before and have trouble describing now. It was like watching a man hear a sound from a part of the house he'd nailed shut. "Get them inside," he said. "Holly's the stove, get it roaring." And then to the woman, gentle in a way I hadn't known was in him, "You're at the Bram place, ma'am. You're safe now. Don't try to talk." He carried her in himself. The boy wouldn't be parted from her sleeve, so Eli carried them near enough together, the woman in his arms and the child trotting alongside with a fistful of her wet dress, and I stood in the barn a moment with the 2 horses steaming and thought, well, something started now. I don't know what, but it started. That night I wrote in my tally book, and I've still got the page. The hand is shaky from the cold, it says. April 9. Pulled a widow and a boy from the West Wash, wagon a total loss. She is heavy with child. Eli took them in. He looked at them like a man looking at a window he thought was a wall. God help us all. I don't know why I wrote that last part. It wasn't like me to. But I've learned to trust the things I wrote before I understood them better than the things I tell myself now. It took 2 days for Sarah Coyle to thaw enough to tell her story, and she told it plain, sitting up in Ruth Bram's old bed with Ruth Bram's old quilt over her, which I don't think Eli let himself think too hard about. Her husband was John Coyle. They'd come west out of Missouri the year before chasing a piece of land his brother had written him about, a piece that, when they finally got to it, turned out to be either a lie or a misunderstanding, a quarter section of alkali flat that wouldn't grow a grudge. The brother was long gone. John Coyle, a proud man and a stubborn one, would not turn back. He took work where he could get it, moved them 3 times, and the winter took him pneumonia, fast and ugly, in a line shack outside Calder with the wind coming through the chinks. Sarah had buried him with the help of a man whose name she never got, and then she'd done the only thing she could think to do, which was to point what remained of her outfit toward the one other piece of paper in her possession, a letter from a cousin near our county who'd said, years back, if it ever comes to it, come to us. She was going to that cousin when the wash took her wagon. She never made it to that cousin. We'll come to why. And the boy, that was the part that made me set down my coffee. The boy wasn't hers. His name was Tom. He'd been the son of a couple who traveled the same stretch of trail, a German family, and they died, both of them, and a baby sister too, in a sickness that swept a wagon camp outside Calder the same hard winter. Sarah Coyle, herself newly a widow, herself carrying a child, herself with nothing, had looked at this orphaned boy that nobody was rushing to claim, and she had taken his hand and not let go of it. Folks said I was a fool, she told us, matter of fact, smoothing the quilt. A woman in my state, with no man and no money, taking on another mouth. The preacher in Calder offered to send him to a home back east, an asylum, he called it, for orphan children. She said the word asylum the way you'd handle a dead snake. I'd seen what the back of a wagon does to a grown man's spirit, mister. I wasn't going to crate that child up and ship him across the country, to be raised by strangers who'd write a number on him. So you took him, Eli said. He was standing by the door where he always stood, like a man not quite sure he was allowed in his own front room. I took him. She looked at Tom, who was asleep at last in the corner, finally far enough from the river in his mind to let his eyes close. He doesn't talk much. He saw his mother and his father and his baby sister go into the ground in the space of 1 week. A body can't talk after a thing like that. There's no words down low enough. There was a silence in that room you could have stacked hay on. Then Eli Bram said the thing that started all the trouble and all the talk and everything that came after. He said, "You'll stay here till the baby's born, both of you, longer if you've a mind. There's room and there's work for Hollies and me both that an extra pair of hands wouldn't hurt," and he stopped, and his jaw worked, and I swear before God I watched the man push open that nailed-shut part of the house with his bare hands, and I've got too much quiet in this place. I'd take it as a kindness if you'd fill some of it. I'd take it as a kindness if you'd fill some of it. He turned her rescue into her doing him a favor. I've thought about that sentence for 30 years. It's the most decent thing I ever heard a man say, and he said it like he was apologizing for it. Sarah Coyle looked at him a long moment. She was a sharp judge of men, she'd had to be, and I think she was looking for the price tag, the way you do when a thing's offered free, because free on the frontier most always means not yet billed. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't find it, or she found something else. "All right," she said, "but I pay my way, I don't take charity. I cook, I mend, I doctor, I've a fair hand at doctoring. The boy works too, light work, what he's able. We're not poor relations and we're not your burden. We're hands you've hired who don't draw wages. That's the deal or there's no deal." And Eli, and this is the only time in 2 years I saw him do it, Eli laughed. Just once. A short surprised bark of a thing, like the laugh had been in storage so long it came out with dust on it. "That's the deal," he said. Now here is where I have to tell you the thing the storytellers always leave out, because it doesn't fit the sermon they want to make of it. They tell it like Eli Bram was a saint who opened his door out of the pure goodness of his heart and the frontier marveled at his charity. And there's truth in that. But it wasn't the whole truth, and Eli would have been the first to spit on the saint version. That night late, I came in from the barn and Eli was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark with a lamp unlit in front of him, and a cup of something that wasn't coffee, and he said to me without turning around, "You think I'm a fool, Hollies." "I think you're a lot of things," I said, easing down into the other chair on account of my knees. "Fool's down the list a ways." "She reminds me of Ruth." His thumb was moving on the rim of the cup round and round, not to look at. Ruth was small and dark and this one's tall and fair. It's the way she holds herself like she's daring the world to take one more thing. Ruth was like that right to the end. The fever had her and she was still bossing me about the seed corn. He was quiet a moment. "And that boy." "Tom." "That boy," Eli said, and his voice did a thing I won't ever forget. It just folded in the middle like a knee giving out. "Is the same age my Thomas would have been, if he'd lived past the week. We had a name picked, Thomas, after my father." He turned and looked at me and his eyes in the dark were wet and furious, furious at me for being there to see it, furious at himself, furious at the whole arrangement of the world. "Same name, Hollies, same age. He walked into my barn with the same name. Now you tell me what a man's supposed to do with that. You tell me how a man's supposed to send that down the road." I didn't have an answer. I worried my matchstick down to nothing, and we sat in the dark a while, two old fools, and finally I said the only true thing I had. "You're not supposed to do anything with it, Eli. You're just supposed to feed 'em and keep 'em warm and let it be what it is. The why of it ain't your business. Plenty of folks do a kindness for a selfish reason. The widow eats the same either way." He nodded slow, and then he said the thing I should have paid more mind to. "It's not the doing of it that frightens me," he said. "It's how bad I want to. I haven't wanted anything in 2 years, Hollies. I made sure of it. Wanting's what cost me." He stood up, tall and tired, and took his cup to the basin. "A man can survive losing what he can't help loving. I've proved that. I don't know if I can survive it twice on purpose." He blew out a breath, took up the lamp he never lit. "Get some sleep," he said. "Calving's not done with us yet." And he went up to bed in the house where, for the first time in 2 years, other people were sleeping, and I went out to the bunk in the barn, and I lay there listening to the wash still running brown and full in the dark, the same water that had near killed 3 people that morning, running on like it had no memory of it at all. I took out my tally book by what light there was. I wrote one more line under the day's entry. I can read it still. "He's not afraid she'll be a burden. He's afraid she won't be." I didn't fully know yet what I meant by it. I'd find out. The whole county would find out. But that's the next part of the telling, and it gets harder before it gets easier, the way true things mostly do. Word travels faster than weather out here, and meaner. By the time the May grass was up, every soul within a hard day's ride knew that Eli Bram had a woman and a boy living up at his place, and not one of them had the story straight. I heard 4 versions in the span of one afternoon at the feed store in Calder, and not a one of them had a wash or a drowned ox or a letter to a cousin in it. The versions had appetites. They wanted something to chew. The kindest version had it that Eli had taken in a poor widow out of Christian charity, and that was treated as faintly suspicious. The way a man buying drinks for the house is suspicious. What's he after? The unkindest version, which I heard from a hatchet-faced woman named Dorcas Pell who ran the boarding house, and the gossip of the county like 2 halves of one business, had it that Sarah Coyle was no widow at all, but a woman of low character who'd attached herself to a lonely man with money, and that the baby she carried was likely Eli's own, conceived in sin, and the dead husband a convenient story. I stood at the counter with a sack of flour on my shoulder and listened to Dorcas Pell lay this out to 2 other women, and I'll tell you, I am not a violent man at my age, but I came nearer to swinging a 50-pound sack of flour at a church-going woman's head than I ever have before or since. What stopped me wasn't good sense. It was knowing it'd be one more log on her fire. That child's husband, I said instead, real quiet, setting the flower down, died of pneumonia in a line shack outside this very town not 5 months back. Half of you sent flowers, I expect, or said you would. She buried him with her own 2 hands and walked her wagon near 300 miles after. The boy she's raising lost his whole family to the camp sickness. The same sickness, Mrs. Pell, that I recall took your nephew, so you know the size of it. Now you can talk how you like. It's a free country, and your mouth is your own. But I've sat at the table with that woman every night for 6 weeks, and there's not a one of you in this store fit to scrape the mud off her boots. It was the longest speech I'd made in a decade. My face was hot. Dorcas Pell looked at me the way a cat looks at a dog that's barked at it through a window, unbothered, already composing what she'd say when I'd gone. "Well," she said, "he's certainly defended, isn't he?" And there it was. I'd just become part of the story. Even the old hired hands gone soft over her. You cannot win against people who have decided to enjoy a thing. I picked up my flower and left, and behind me I heard the talk close over the place where I'd stood like water over a thrown stone. I didn't tell Eli or Sarah the worst of it, but Sarah, being who she was, didn't need telling. She knew, of course she knew. She'd been a woman alone long enough to feel the weather of a town change when she walked into it. The first time she rode in with us, she insisted on coming, big as she was, to trade some doctoring herbs she'd gathered and dried. I watched the street do its thing. The conversations that stopped. The mothers who found a sudden reason to draw their children in. One man tipped his hat too low, and another didn't tip his at all, and a knot of women by the church gate didn't even bother to lower their voices. Sarah Coyle walked through all of it with her chin level and her hand resting on the swell of her belly and Tom's hand held tight in her other one, and she conducted her business at the apothecary's like there was nobody else alive in the world. She did not hurry. She did not look down. When the apothecary's wife was short with her, she was long and gracious right back, killing the woman with a courtesy so flawless it became its own kind of slap. And when we'd loaded the wagon and turned for home, only then, only when the town was behind us, did I see her shoulders come down off the rack she'd hung them on. "You don't have to come to town," I said. "Eli and I can do the trading." "I'll not hide," she said. "Hiding tells them they were right to talk." She looked out at the country going by. "My mother taught me a thing, Mr. Webb," she said. "They'll write your story whether you're in the room or not, so you might as well be in the room. I'll be in the room. Let them choke on it." Tom, between us on the bench, was watching her face the way he watched everything, silent, soaking it up, learning what a person does. He hadn't said more than a dozen words since the wash, but I noticed he'd started copying things. The way Sarah held her chin. The way Eli checked a horse's feet, lifting each one and running a thumb along the frog of the hoof. The boy was building himself, quiet, out of pieces of the 2 people who'd kept him. I found that near unbearable to watch, and I couldn't stop watching it. Eli took the talk harder than Sarah did, and in a different way, and this is the part I've never told anybody, because it doesn't make him look like the saint they made him. There came a Sunday in early June when a delegation rode out to the place. 3 men. One was the preacher from Calder, Reverend Stoss, a tall, pale man with a voice like a hinge. One was a county man, some kind of official, soft hands and a watch chain. And one was Sarah's own cousin, the cousin she'd been traveling toward when the wash got her. His name was Amos Riddle, and he'd heard, finally, that his kin was alive and sheltering on a stranger's ranch instead of arriving decent at his own door. And he had come, he said, to set things right. I was mending tack in the barn and heard most of it through the open door, and what I didn't hear, Eli told me after. The county man spoke first, oily. He spoke of appearances, of how a single woman in her condition, residing with 2 unmarried men, gave rise to unfortunate impressions that reflected on the whole community. The preacher spoke of sin and the avoiding of its appearance, which he held to be near as bad as the thing itself. And the cousin, Amos Riddle, spoke of family, of how it was only right that Sarah and the boy come to live under his roof, where things would be proper, where there was a woman of the house, his wife, to see to her. It was, on its face, a reasonable thing. A widow ought to be with kin. I'll grant that. If I'd heard it about somebody else, I'd have nodded along. But I'd seen Amos Riddle's kind before. There was a flatness in his eyes when he talked about family that didn't match the words, and when he said the boy, he said it the way you'd say the dog, a thing that comes with the woman, an extra mouth, a problem to be solved. And I learned later from Sarah that Amos Riddle had 11 children of his own, and a hardscrabble farm and a wife worn down to a thread, and that what he wanted Sarah for was the unpaid labor of a strong woman and the small inheritance she'd told him about in a letter once, $40 and a gold locket, the whole of John Coyle's estate. And what he wanted Tom for was nothing. Tom was the part of the bargain he meant to put back. The asylum back east takes orphan boys, he'd say later. No sense her ruining her prospects over another man's leavings. Eli stood on his own porch and listened to all three of them. And here's the thing the legend gets wrong. Eli Bram did not, in that moment, rise up righteous and throw them off his land. That's how they tell it now. They tell it like he stood like a prophet and shamed them. He didn't. He wavered. I watched him do it. Through the barn door I watched my friend stand there and chew on it, because the county man and the preacher had landed on the one fear that lived at the center of Eli Bram, the fear of wanting something too much. They'd made it sound like the decent thing, the humble thing, was to let them go, to not hold on. And Eli had spent 2 years training himself to not hold on. They were speaking to him in his own native tongue. Maybe they're right, he said to me that night, hollow. Maybe I'm a selfish old fool keeping them here because the house is quiet. Maybe she'd be better off with her own blood. Who am I to her, Hollies? I'm a man she's known 8 weeks. Riddle's family. Riddle's a man who counted the locket before he counted the woman, I said. You want to talk about selfish? Let's talk about the kind that hides behind proper. You don't know that about him. I know it the way you know weather, I said. And so do you. You're just so set on not wanting them that you'll hand them to a wolf to prove you didn't. He didn't answer me. He went to bed angry, at me or himself I couldn't say. It was Sarah who settled it, and she settled it her own way, and it was the morally heavy thing, the choice that turned the whole story, though it didn't look like much from the outside. She'd heard the whole conversation too. She heard it from the kitchen window. And the next morning she didn't rage and she didn't weep. She came out to where Eli was forking hay, and she stood there with her hands folded under the shelf of the baby, and she said, Eli told me this word for word more than once over the years, like a thing he was keeping safe. She said, I'll go to my cousin, Mr. Bram, if you tell me to. You pulled me from a river and you owe me nothing, and I'll not be the rock that sinks your good name in this county, but I'll not take Tom there. Amos will send that boy east inside a month. I know it the way you know weather. I heard Mr. Webb say that to you through the wall, and he's right. So, if I go to my cousin, the boy can't come, which means I need to know one thing from you, and then I'll do whatever you say. She took a breath. If I leave Tom here, if I ride to Amos and leave that child with you, will you keep him? Not as a hired boy, as yours. Will you raise him? She'd done it. Do you see what she'd done? She'd taken her own salvation off the table entire. She'd offered to walk into the wolf's house to spend herself, her labor, and her freedom in Amos Riddle's hard kitchen for the rest of her days, on the one condition that the boy be safe. She'd found the exact thing she could trade that the talkers couldn't touch, and she'd put it down on the table. Take my whole life, but not the child's. And she'd done it knowing, this is the part that takes my breath even now, she'd done it knowing it forced Eli's hand on the very thing he was most afraid of. She made him say out loud to her face whether he would keep a boy named Thomas, the same age and name as the son he'd buried. She made him choose in the open between his fear and that child. There was no hiding behind proper anymore. There was a woman standing in his hay and a boy in the doorway who'd surely heard, the way he heard everything, and Eli Bram had to answer. I was there for this part. I'd come up from the barn. I saw the boy in the doorway. Eli set down the hayfork. He looked at Sarah a long time, and then he looked past her at Tom in the doorway, that silent boy, who was looking back at him with an expression I can only call braced. A child who has already lost every adult he ever trusted and is watching to learn whether it's about to happen a fourth time. And Eli Bram said, "No." Sarah's face, I saw it fall, just for a second. She thought he meant no, I won't keep him. She'd gambled everything and lost, and I watched a lifetime of bracing go through her in one heartbeat. Eli said again, and his voice was rough as a rasp, "You're not going to Amos riddles. Neither of you is going anywhere. I've been a coward about this near 2 months, and I'm done. I won't keep the boy instead of you, Sarah. I'll keep you both, or I'll," and here the man's voice quit on him entire and he had to start over. "I'll keep you both. If you'll have a quiet old fool who's so scared of wanting things he near gave away the 2 best things ever to land in his pasture. I'm asking you to marry me. Not to stop the talk be damned. I'm asking because I want to, and I haven't let myself want anything since I put Ruth in the ground, and I'd plain forgotten that a man's not alive who doesn't want something. I want this. I want you at my table and that boy in my house, and I want to be there when that baby comes. There. It's said. Now you can say no, and I'll drive you to your cousin myself and never trouble you again. But you'll not throw your life away to save the boys, because you don't have to. There's room for the whole of you here. There always was. I was just too afraid to say so." There was a silence then that I'd put up against any silence in my life. And Tom, silent Tom, who hadn't said a sentence since the camp sickness took his whole world, Tom said, from the doorway, in a small rusty voice like a gate that hadn't swung in a long while, "Say yes, Mama." It was the second time he'd called her that. The first was at the river, screaming it when he thought she'd drown. This time he said it soft, "Mama." And then he looked at Eli, and the boy's whole face was a question he didn't have the words for, a question about whether he was allowed, after everything, to belong to somebody again. Sarah Coyle put one hand over her mouth. She was not a woman who cried easy. I'd not seen her do it once, not at the river, not in town, not under any of it. She cried then. Just stood in the hay with her hand over her mouth and the tears running and the baby high and round between her and the man asking her to stay. "Yes," she said behind her hand. "Yes, you fool, yes." They were married 11 days later by a circuit preacher passing through, not Reverend Stoss. Sarah wouldn't have him, and I didn't blame her. It was a small thing in the front room of the Bram place. Me and the circuit man and the 3 of them and a cake Sarah baked herself because she'd not let anyone do for her, even on her own wedding day. Tom wore a shirt Sarah had cut down from one of Eli's and stood between them the whole time with a hand on each, like he was the one marrying them to each other, which in a way he was. The talk in town did not stop. If anything, it changed key. He married her. That became its own scandal for a while, proof to the Dorcas Pells of the world that there'd been something improper to begin with. You cannot win. I told you that. People who want a story will keep the story regardless of the facts. The facts just become evidence for the tale they already prefer. But a thing had shifted, all the same, and it shifted because of how Eli and Sarah carried it. They didn't slink. They came to town together, the 3 of them and soon to be 4, and they did their trading and tipped their hats and asked after folks' health, and they were so plainly, stubbornly decent, and Sarah so plainly, stubbornly not ashamed, that over the months it got harder and harder for the meanness to find purchase. You can gossip a long time about a sinner. It's tiresome work gossiping about 2 tired ranchers and a quiet boy who pay their bills and mind their business and bring you soup when your own child takes fever, which Sarah did more than once, for the very families who talked about her, because she was a fair hand at doctoring, and she would not let a child suffer to spite its mother. That's what became the talk of the frontier in the end. Not the scandal, the opposite of the scandal. The slow, grinding way that one stubborn woman's refusal to be shamed, and one frightened man's decision to want something out loud simply outlasted the meanness of an entire county. But I'm getting ahead, because the baby hadn't come yet. And when it came hard, and it came in the worst of a summer storm, and it brought the wash up high and brown again, the same wash, running full, like the country wanted to remind us all that it gives nothing for free. The baby decided to come on the worst night of that whole summer, and I have always taken it as the country's idea of a joke, a hard one, the kind it tells with a straight face. It was late July. The heat had been building for a week, that thick standing heat that makes the cattle stupid and the dogs mean. And then on the night of the 28th it broke all at once into a storm such as I'd not seen since I came to that county. Not just rain. Whether the wind laid the grass flat and tore a sheet of tin half off the barn roof, and the lightning came so steady you could have read by it, and the thunder didn't roll so much as land, like something falling out of the sky onto the house. And the wash, our wash, the same brown serpent that had near taken Sarah and Tom and me back in April, came up out of its bed and ran high and ugly across the bottom of the property between us and town, between us and the doctor. And of course, that was the night Sarah Coyle, who'd been Sarah Bram for a few weeks by then, woke Eli with her hand clamped hard on his arm and said the baby was coming and it was coming fast. I was in the house by then. They'd moved me up out of the barn after the wedding. Sarah wouldn't hear of a man my age sleeping out with the horses, said it was a waste of a good back room and an insult to her cooking that I wouldn't be near it. So I was there when it started, and I'll tell you the truth. I have helped 100 cows calve and not one woman birth a child, and the difference is everything. And I was no use at all except to do what I was told and to keep the fire up and the water hot and to keep Tom occupied. Eli wanted to ride for the doctor. He had his boots half on. And Sarah, between the pains, said the thing that I think about most of all the things she said in the time I knew her. She said, "You're not crossing that wash, Eli Bram. I did not pull myself out of that water and stand up in front of this whole county and marry you to watch you drown getting a doctor I don't need. I've done this before." We all went still. "I've done this before." She'd never said it, not in all the months, but it came clear in a rush, the way the worst things do. There'd been a child back in Missouri before they ever came west, a child that hadn't lived. She'd birthed it alone in a sod house with John Coyle gone for the doctor across a flooded creek, and the doctor had come too late, and the creek had nearly taken John on the way, and the baby had died anyhow. She'd carried that the whole time. The whole time she'd been so fierce about doing for herself, never taking charity, never bending. It was that. It was a woman who'd learned that the help you wait for across a flood comes too late, and that the only hands you can count on are your own. "You stay," she said to Eli, gripping his arm, looking at him with the storm white at the windows. "You stay here in this room where I can see you. I've birthed a baby alone before and I'll not do it again. Do you hear me? Don't you cross that water. Don't you leave me to do it alone." And here is the second hard choice of this story, and it was Eli's, and it was the harder one because it asked him to do nothing, which for a man who loves somebody and is terrified, is the very hardest thing there is. Every instinct he had was screaming to act, to ride, to fetch, to fix it with his hands and his horse and his will, the way a man fixes things. And there was real reason in it. Births go wrong, and a doctor can mean a life, and if he stayed and the worst happened, he'd carry it forever. He stood there with one boot on and the rain coming sideways and his wife telling him to stay, and I watched him understand that the bravest thing, the most loving thing, was to not go be a hero across the flood. To stay in the room and hold her hand and be no use and be present, which was the one thing the doctor across the water could never be. And the one thing John Coyle hadn't been able to be, and the one thing she had asked of him. He took his boot off. He sat down beside her and he took her hand and he said, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." And he didn't. Through the whole long roaring night of it, he did not. He held her hand and he let her near break the bones in it, and he said the same thing over and over, "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere," until it stopped being words and became just a sound she could hold onto, the way you'd hold a rope. I won't lay out the long misery of a hard birth. It's not mine to tell, and you don't need it. I'll say only that it went on near 6 hours, and that twice I thought we'd lost the thread of it, and that Sarah Coyle was the bravest creature I have ever seen, man nor beast, and that toward the gray end of it, when the storm was finally tearing itself out west of us and the first sick light was coming up, the baby came. A girl. She came out blue and silent, and my heart stopped dead, because I'd seen that color on calves that didn't make it, and Eli's face when he saw it. I cannot describe Eli's face. It was the face of a man watching the third small stone get carved for the plot up on the rise. But Sarah, exhausted past anything, reached out and took that silent blue child and turned it over on her own forearm and struck it twice on the back. Hard, harder than I'd have dared, businesslike. A woman who had learned the price of being gentle too long, and the baby coughed, and pulled in a breath that you could hear over the dying storm and screamed. I have heard a lot of sounds in 50-some years of living. I have never heard a better one. Eli Bram put his face down into the quilt beside his wife and his new daughter, and he wept like I have never seen a man weep, great silent shudders of it, 2 years and 3 gravestones and a whole bank-down heart coming up out of him at once. And Sarah, who had just done the hardest work a body can do, put her free hand on the back of his head and held it there and said, soft, teasing him even then. "See, didn't need the doctor, told you." And from the doorway, because Tom had not slept, of course he hadn't, the boy missed nothing. From the doorway came that small, rusty voice, the third time I'd heard him use it. "What's her name?" Sarah looked at Eli. Eli lifted his wet face, and something passed between them, some question and answer, and Sarah said, "Ruth, we'll call her Ruth." I had to leave the room then. I went out onto the porch into the wet gray morning, and I stood there with the wash still running brown and loud below the property, and I worried a matchstick down to splinters, and I did not let myself make any sound, because a man's got his pride. Eli had named the baby after his first wife, the wife Sarah had every right to be jealous of, whose quilt she slept under, whose bed she'd been pulled half dead into, and Sarah had offered it, had handed that name to him like a gift, because she understood something about the man she'd married that the whole gossiping county never would, that you don't heal a grief by replacing it. You heal it by making room for it to sit at the same table as the joy. Little Ruth would grow up knowing she was named for a woman she'd never met, who'd come before her, who'd been loved. There was no jealousy in Sarah big enough to grudge a dead woman her name. There was just room. There was always, in that woman, room. Now I could end it there. The storytellers do. They end it on the baby's cry and the name and the sun coming up, and they make it a tidy thing, a fable about how kindness is rewarded and the good get their happy ending. But I told you at the start that wasn't the whole of it, and I'll keep my word, because the part they leave off is the part that ever mattered to me. That fall, Amos Riddle filed a paper. He'd not let it go, you see, the locket, the $40, but more than that, the pride of it. A man like Amos Riddle cannot stand to be bested by a woman who chose a stranger's roof over his blood. So he found a lawyer in the county seat, and the lawyer found a line in the law, and the line said that an orphaned child like Tom, with no living kin and no legal guardian of record, was a ward of the county, and that a blood relation by marriage, which is what Amos became the day Sarah wed Eli, had a stronger claim than a stepfather with no papers. He filed to take the boy, not because he wanted him. I'll say it plain because it's true. He filed to take Tom so he could send him east and pocket the small fee the asylum paid for delivered orphans, and despite the woman who'd shamed him, all in the one stroke. It went to a hearing, in Calder, in the very town that had talked about Sarah Coyle for 6 months. And here is the thing I never could have predicted, The thing that taught me the most about people of anything I ever saw, the town turned up for them. Not all of it. Dorcas Pell sat in the back with her mouth like a buttonhole. But the families whose children Sarah had doctored through the fever, they came. The man who hadn't tipped his hat now sat in the front row with his hat in his hands. The apothecary's wife, who'd been short with Sarah that first day, stood up when the judge asked if any could speak to the boys' welfare in the Bram home, and she said, "This hatchet of a woman, gone soft somewhere in the months between." She said she'd never seen a child better cared for, that the Brams paid their bills and minded their own and asked nothing of anyone, and that if the county had any sense it'd leave well enough be. And Tom, who'd barely strung 3 sentences together in over a year, Tom stood up when the judge kindly asked him where he wished to live. The whole room held its breath. The boy looked at Amos Riddle, and then he looked at Eli and Sarah with the baby Ruth in Sarah's arms, and he said, in a voice that had gotten stronger all that summer from being safe enough to use, "I want to stay with my mother and my father. I lost the first ones. These are the ones I've got. These are the ones I've got." A child of 11 said that in a courtroom, and there was not a dry eye in it but the judge's and Amos Riddle's, and the judge's didn't stay dry long. He ruled for the Brams inside of an hour. Eli adopted the boy legal and proper that same winter. Amos Riddle rode home with his locket greed and his spite and got neither, and I am ashamed to say I enjoyed watching him go more than a Christian man should. That's the story they tell as a sermon. The rancher's kindness, the widow saved, the orphan kept, the town redeemed, the wicked cousin sent off empty. And every bit of that's true, and I'll not take it from anybody. But I'm an old man now, older than Eli got to be, and I find I don't tell it for the sermon. I tell it for the small thing nobody else remembers because I'm the only one left who saw it. Years on, Ruth was maybe 6, and Tom near grown and already taller than Eli. I came up to the house one evening from the barn and stopped at the window, the way an old hand does, just to look at a thing before going into it. And inside, in the lamplight, was the whole of them at the table. Sarah at one end with the gray come into her fair hair. Eli at the other, gone soft and easy in a way the man I'd pulled the widow home to never could have been. The boy, the girl, an ordinary supper. Nothing happening at all. And I understood. Standing out there in the dark with the wash running quiet in its bed below, running low, that night harmless, the same water, I understood that this was the thing. Not the rescue, not the wedding, not the courtroom. This, the ordinary unremarkable miracle of 4 people at a table who, by every right and reason of the hard country around them, should never have found each other at all and had anyway, and had decided to keep deciding it every plain evening forever. The frontier has no mercy in it. Folks'll tell you that, and they're not wrong. The country doesn't give. But I learned on the Bram place that mercy was never something the country was supposed to provide. Mercy was the thing we were meant to bring to it, to carry into a place that had none, and set it down, and keep it lit against all that dark, the way you'd keep a fire banked through a long, cold night. Eli kept his small for 2 years to survive. Then a river handed him a reason to let it burn, and he was brave enough, finally, to be scared and want it anyway. I never married, never had a table of my own with the lamp on it. I don't say that for pity, it's just the shape my life took. But I had a back room in that house for near 20 years, and I had a place at that table every night, and the children called me Uncle Hollies. And when I'm an honest old man with myself, I know that the family Eli Bram pulled out of a wash one spring afternoon. They pulled me out of something too. Something I'd been drowning in slow for years and never named. I've got the tally book still, the greasy one tied with twine. The last thing I wrote in it, the night I'm telling you about, the night I stood at the window in the dark, was this. I'll read it to you just as it is, and then I'm done, because the rest of it you can figure for yourself, and I've never trusted a story that explained its own ending. July, some years on, stood at the window tonight and watched them eat their supper. Nothing happened. I cried like a fool over nothing happening. I think that was the whole point, and it took me 20 years to see it. The boy is taller than Eli now. the water's running low. And then there's one more line, and the hand is bad because it was dark, and I was older, and I couldn't see the page.